The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of downtown London as thousands of people gathered for the annual Royal Guard parade. Margaret Thornfield adjusted her expensive designer handbag and checked her diamond-studded watch for the third time in 5 minutes. She had arrived in her luxury sedan, expecting immediate access to the front viewing area that she believed her social status and wealth entitled her to. Margaret came from old money. Her family had owned textile mills for generations, and she had never heard the word no without finding a way around it. At 52, she carried herself with the kind of arrogance that comes from a lifetime of getting exactly what she wanted, when she wanted it. Her perfectly styled blonde hair, tailored clothing, and confident stride announced to everyone around her that she considered herself superior to the common people lining the parade route. The crowd was already thick with excited families, tourists, snapping photos, and locals who had been waiting since dawn to secure good spots. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, clutching small British flags and chattering excitedly about seeing the famous red-uniformed guards march past. Street vendors moved through the crowd selling programs and souvenirs, while police officers maintained order at the barriers that separated spectators from the parade route. Margaret pushed through the crowd without apologizing, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She wore a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her jewelry caught the morning light as she moved. Several people turned to look at her, some with annoyance as she bumped into them without acknowledgement, others with curiosity at her obvious display of wealth. When she reached the front barrier, Margaret was shocked to find her path blocked by ordinary people who had clearly been there much longer than she had. A young mother with 2 small children occupied what Margaret considered to be the prime viewing spot, directly in front of the main reviewing stand. The woman had spread a small blanket on the ground and was sharing snacks with her children, while they waited patiently for the ceremony to begin. "Excuse me," Margaret said sharply, tapping the woman on the shoulder. "I need you to move. I have reserved seating here." Her voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to immediate obedience, but the young mother looked confused. "I'm sorry, but this is public viewing," the woman replied politely. "We've been here since 6 this morning. There aren't any reserved seats along the barriers." She gestured to the clearly marked public viewing area, where hundreds of people stood behind the metal barriers that separated them from the parade route. Margaret's face began to redden. She had assumed that her usual tactics of name-dropping and intimidation would quickly clear a path for her, but she was discovering that royal events operated differently than the exclusive social clubs and private venues she was used to. The democratic nature of public viewing areas was a foreign concept to someone who had spent her entire life in spaces where money bought immediate access and preferential treatment. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Margaret's voice rose above the general chatter of the crowd. "My family has been supporting the royal family for generations. I demand to speak to whoever is in charge here immediately." She began digging through her handbag, presumably looking for some form of identification that would prove her importance. The young mother remained calm but firm. "I understand you might be frustrated, but everyone here has the same right to watch the parade. The ceremony starts in about 30 minutes, and I'm sure you can find a good spot if you look around." She turned back to her children, clearly hoping to end the uncomfortable conversation. But Margaret was just getting started. The idea that she might have to stand behind common people, that her wealth and family name carried no weight in this situation, was completely unacceptable to her worldview. She had never learned to handle disappointment or rejection gracefully, and the presence of so many witnesses only made her more determined to assert what she saw as her rightful place. The crowd around them was beginning to take notice of the brewing confrontation. Some people started pulling out their phones, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Others tried to move away, not wanting to be caught up in whatever drama was unfolding. But most people simply watched with a mixture of curiosity and secondhand embarrassment as Margaret's entitlement clash with the reality of public spaces began to escalate into something much more serious. The royal guards had not yet taken their positions, but palace security personnel were already stationed throughout the area. They had been trained to handle all sorts of disruptions, from overzealous tourists to protest attempts, But they were not yet aware that Margaret Thornfield was about to create a situation that would be talked about for years to come and captured on dozens of cameras for the entire world to see. Margaret's frustration reached a boiling point as more people began gathering around the confrontation. Her face had turned an alarming shade of red that clashed terribly with her expensive cream coat. The young mother with her children was no longer paying attention to Margaret's demands, which only fueled her rage further. In Margaret's mind, being ignored was perhaps worse than being directly refused. "Security!" Margaret shouted, waving her arms dramatically above her head. "I need security here immediately." Her voice carried across the crowd, causing dozens of heads to turn in her direction. Several children started crying at the sudden loud outburst, and their parents began looking around nervously, unsure whether there was some kind of emergency they should be worried about. A uniformed police officer approached the disturbance, his expression professional but wary. Constable James Mitchell had been working crowd control at royal events for over a decade, and he had seen every type of disruption imaginable. He immediately recognized Margaret's type: wealthy, entitled, and completely convinced that normal rules didn't apply to her. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Mitchell asked calmly, positioning himself between Margaret and the family she had been harassing. His presence should have been calming, but instead it seemed to encourage Margaret to become even more dramatic in her complaints. "Finally, someone with authority," Margaret declared, straightening her shoulders and looking down her nose at the officer, despite the fact that he was several inches taller than her. "I need these people removed, immediately. They're occupying my viewing area." She gestured dismissively at the young mother and her children as if they were objects to be cleared away, rather than people with equal rights. Officer Mitchell looked around at the clearly marked public viewing area, then back at Margaret with barely concealed disbelief. "Ma'am, this is a public viewing area. Everyone here has the same right to watch the parade. There are no reserved sections along these barriers." His tone remained professional, but there was a slight edge that suggested his patience was already wearing thin. "Don't you dare, ma'am." "Me," Margaret snapped. "I am Mrs. Margaret Thornfield of the Thornfield textile family. We have been major donors to royal charities for decades. I demand to speak to your superior officer immediately, and I want these people moved to a less desirable location." Her voice had taken on the shrill quality that comes from someone who has never been told no, learning that their usual tactics aren't working. The crowd around them was growing larger as people sensed drama unfolding. Phones were now openly recording the scene, and Margaret's outrageous behavior was being captured from multiple angles. Social media notifications were already starting to ping as early videos began circulating online, though Margaret remained completely oblivious to the fact that her public meltdown was being documented for posterity. Officer Mitchell's expression hardened slightly. He had dealt with entitled people before, but Margaret's complete lack of awareness about how inappropriate her behavior was struck him as particularly offensive. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm going to ask you to lower your voice and move along. You're disrupting other people's enjoyment of the event, and if you continue, I'll have to ask you to leave the viewing area entirely." This threat only made Margaret more furious. The idea that she might be asked to leave a royal event, something she considered herself naturally entitled to attend, was beyond her comprehension. "You cannot be serious," she said, her voice rising to near shouting levels. "Do you understand who my family is? We practically built this city. I will have your job for treating me this way." By now, the young mother had gathered her children and moved away from the confrontation, not wanting them exposed to Margaret's increasingly unhinged behavior. Other families began following suit, creating a growing circle of empty space around Margaret and the police officer. But instead of recognizing that her behavior was driving people away, Margaret interpreted the space as validation that she was finally getting the special treatment she deserved. The royal guards were beginning to take their positions for the ceremony, their red uniforms bright against the gray London morning. They moved with practiced precision, each step perfectly synchronized, their tall black hats making them appear even more imposing than their already impressive height. The crowd's attention should have been shifting to these magnificent soldiers, but instead, all eyes remained focused on Margaret's escalating tantrum. One particular guard, Sergeant William Hayes, had been assigned to a position near the viewing area where Margaret was causing her disturbance. At 28 years old, he had served with distinction for 8 years and had never experienced anything like what was about to happen to him. He stood perfectly still, eyes forward, maintaining the stoic composure that the Royal Guards were famous for worldwide. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but nothing had prepared him for Margaret Thornfield. The parade ceremony began with the traditional trumpet fanfare echoing across the historic streets. The Royal Guards marched in perfect formation, their polished boots creating a rhythmic cadence that normally would have commanded everyone's attention. However, Margaret Thornfield had become so consumed with her perceived mistreatment that she barely noticed the magnificent display happening just feet away from her. Sergeant William Hayes took his ceremonial position near the barriers, standing at perfect attention with his rifle held precisely across his chest. His red uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, his tall bearskin hat adding to his already impressive stature. Like all Royal Guards, he had undergone extensive training to maintain absolute composure regardless of what happened around him. Tourists often tried to make the guards laugh, shout at them, or even touch them, but Hayes had never broken character during his 8 years of service. Margaret's argument with Officer Mitchell had reached a stalemate. The policeman had made it clear that she would not be receiving any special treatment, and she would need to either find an available spot like everyone else, or leave the viewing area entirely. But Margaret had never backed down from a confrontation in her life, especially not in front of so many witnesses. Her reputation for getting her way was at stake, and she was becoming increasingly desperate to assert her authority over the situation. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Margaret declared loudly, her voice carrying clearly over the ceremonial music. "I refuse to be treated like some common tourist." She began pacing back and forth along the barrier, her designer heels clicking angrily against the pavement. The crowd watched her with a mixture of fascination and horror, unable to look away from her spectacular public meltdown. Officer Mitchell tried one more time to defuse the situation. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm going to give you one final warning. Either find a spot and enjoy the ceremony quietly, or I will have to escort you away from the viewing area. Your choice." His tone had shifted from professional courtesy to clear authority, but Margaret was too far gone to recognize the seriousness of his warning. "Don't you threaten me?" Margaret shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at the officer. "I know people in high places. I'll have you fired and blacklisted from ever working security again." Her threats were becoming more elaborate and desperate, as it became clear that her usual intimidation tactics weren't working on anyone present. It was at this moment that Margaret noticed Sergeant Hayes standing motionless in his ceremonial position. Something about his perfect posture and unwavering attention to duty seemed to trigger something in her already unstable mental state. Here was someone who was clearly following orders, standing exactly where he had been told to stand, doing exactly what he had been trained to do. In Margaret's twisted logic, this made him the perfect target for her frustration. "You there, guard," Margaret called out, approaching the barrier that separated the viewing area from the ceremonial space. "I need you to tell your superior that I require immediate assistance. These people are refusing to show me the proper respect." Her voice had taken on an almost pleading quality, as if she genuinely believed that the ceremonial guard would abandon his post to help her with her seating dispute. Sergeant Hayes, of course, remained perfectly still. His training had taught him to ignore all distractions and maintain his position regardless of what happened around him. He had been shouted at, photographed, and even had objects thrown at him during previous ceremonies, but he had never broken character. His eyes remained focused straight ahead, and he gave no indication that he had even heard Margaret's demands. This complete lack of response was the final straw for Margaret. In her mind, she had been ignored, dismissed and disrespected by everyone she had encountered that morning. The guard's professional silence felt like the ultimate insult to someone who had never been denied attention in her entire privileged life. "I am talking to you," Margaret shouted, moving closer to the barrier. "When someone of my status speaks to you, you answer." The crowd around her began to murmur with concern, sensing that something terrible was about to happen, but unable to believe that anyone would be foolish enough to interfere with a royal guard during an official ceremony. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, waving it frantically in the air. "My family has donated millions to royal charities. We practically pay your salary. The least you can do is acknowledge me when I'm speaking to you." Her voice had become shrill and desperate, and several people in the crowd started recording, more actively, realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. When Sergeant Hayes continued to maintain his stoic silence, Margaret made a decision that would change her life forever. Without warning, she climbed over the low barrier that separated the viewing area from the ceremonial space, her expensive coat catching on the metal as she struggled to maintain her balance. Security personnel immediately began moving toward her, but she was moving too quickly for them to intercept. Before anyone could stop her, Margaret Thornfield raised her hand and delivered a sharp, resounding slap across the face of Sergeant William Hayes. The sound of her palm connecting with his cheek echoed across the suddenly silent crowd like a gunshot, and for one frozen moment the entire world seemed to stop breathing. The slap resonated through the air like a thunderclap, and for several heartbeats complete silence fell over the entire viewing area. Hundreds of people stood frozen in shock, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Children stopped chattering, babies stopped crying, and even the ceremonial music seemed to pause as if the universe itself was holding its breath in disbelief. Sergeant William Hayes felt the sting of Margaret's palm across his cheek, but his training took over immediately. Despite the shock of being physically assaulted during a ceremonial duty, he remained perfectly still. His jaw tightened slightly, and a red handprint began to bloom across his face, but he did not flinch, did not turn his head, and did not break his ceremonial posture. His professionalism in that moment was so complete that it bordered on superhuman. Margaret stood there for a moment, her hand still raised from delivering the slap, seemingly as shocked as everyone else by what she had just done. The reality of her actions hadn't fully sunk in yet, but the expressions of horror on the faces surrounding her were beginning to register. For the first time that morning, she looked uncertain, as if she was finally beginning to understand that she might have crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The silence was broken by a collective gasp from the crowd as people began to react to what they had witnessed. Phones that had been recording Margaret's earlier tantrum were now capturing something far more serious. Within seconds, dozens of people were frantically typing and uploading, knowing they had documented something that would be international news within hours. "Oh my God, did she just..." whispered a tourist from Australia, her voice barely audible but somehow carrying in the stunned quiet that followed the assault. "She hit a royal guard," another spectator said in disbelief. She actually hit a royal guard during a ceremony. Officer Mitchell, who had been trying to manage Margaret's disruptive behavior for the past 20 minutes, suddenly found himself dealing with a criminal assault on a member of the Royal Guard. His radio crackled to life as he called for immediate backup, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "All units, we have an assault on ceremonial personnel, requesting immediate assistance at position 7. Security personnel who had been stationed throughout the viewing area began converging on Margaret's location with swift, practiced movements. Their earlier casual alertness had transformed into focused action as they recognized the severity of the situation. This was no longer a simple crowd control issue. This was a serious criminal act against a member of the royal household. Margaret seemed to come back to reality as uniformed officers approached her from multiple directions. The fog of entitlement and rage that had driven her to commit such an unthinkable act began to clear, and she started to comprehend the magnitude of what she had just done. Her face went pale as she realized that every person around her was staring at her with expressions of shock and disgust. Wait, Margaret said, her voice suddenly much quieter and less confident than it had been all morning. "There's been a misunderstanding. I was just trying to get his attention. I didn't mean..." Her words trailed off as she looked around at the sea of hostile faces surrounding her. For the first time in her privileged life, she found herself in a situation where her money and family name would not only fail to help her, they might actually make things worse. The crowd's initial shock was rapidly transforming into something else entirely. People who had been annoyed by Margaret's earlier behavior were now genuinely outraged by her assault on the ceremonial guard. The royal guards were beloved symbols of British tradition and honor, and seeing one of them attacked by an entitled wealthy woman struck a nerve with people from all walks of life. "Arrest her!" someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "She can't treat people like that." "What's wrong with you?" called out another voice. "He's just doing his job." The young mother who had originally been occupying the spot Margaret wanted had returned to the scene with her children safely positioned behind other adults. She looked at Margaret with a mixture of pity and disgust. "I hope it was worth it," she said quietly, but her words carried clearly in the tense atmosphere. "All this because you couldn't stand in line like everyone else." Margaret tried to respond, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her. She had built her entire identity around being superior to other people, but in this moment, she found herself surrounded by ordinary citizens who clearly viewed her as something despicable. The moral authority she had always assumed came with her wealth and status had evaporated completely. Sergeant Hayes continued to maintain his position throughout the chaos swirling around him. His cheek bore the clear mark of Margaret's hand, and cameras were capturing every angle of his stoic professionalism in the face of such disrespectful treatment. His ability to maintain his composure while being physically assaulted would later be hailed as an example of the highest military discipline and dedication to duty. As police officers moved to place Margaret under arrest, she made one final attempt to reassert her perceived authority. "Do you people understand who I am?" she demanded, but her voice cracked with desperation rather than carrying the confident arrogance it had held earlier. "This is all a terrible mistake. I was just frustrated. Surely we can work something out." But the time for working things out had passed the moment her hand connected with the guard's face. Margaret Thornfield had just committed one of the most publicly recorded assaults in recent history, and no amount of money or family connections would be able to undo what the entire world was about to see. The crowd's reaction to Margaret's assault on Sergeant Hayes was unlike anything the veteran police officers had ever witnessed at a public event. What started as shocked silence quickly transformed into a wave of collective outrage that seemed to build momentum with each passing second. The attack on the ceremonial guard had struck a chord that went far deeper than simple rule-breaking. It had violated something fundamental about respect, duty, and human decency. "Shame on you," called out an elderly man who had been quietly watching the parade with his granddaughter. His voice carried the weight of someone who had lived through decades of British history and understood the significance of what he had just witnessed. "That young man serves our country and you attack him for doing his job?" The grandfather's words seemed to unlock something in the crowd. People who had been content to watch Margaret's earlier tantrum as entertainment now found themselves personally offended by her assault on the guard. A chorus of disapproval began to rise from all directions, and Margaret found herself surrounded by hundreds of voices expressing their disgust with her behavior. "Disgusting," shouted a woman holding a toddler. "Absolutely disgusting. How dare you put your hands on him? She should be in jail," declared a teenager who had been recording everything on his phone. "You can't just hit people because you're having a bad day." Margaret looked around desperately, searching for even one sympathetic face in the sea of condemnation surrounding her. But every person she made eye contact with looked back at her with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright anger. The crowd that she had earlier dismissed as beneath her notice was now united in their judgment of her character, and that judgment was harsh. A group of tourists from Japan began applauding Sergeant Hayes for maintaining his composure throughout the assault. Their applause was picked up by others in the crowd, and soon hundreds of people were clapping for the guard who continued to stand at perfect attention, despite the red handprint still visible on his cheek. The appreciation being shown to Hayes only served to highlight the contrast with their feelings toward Margaret. "That's what real class looks like," said a construction worker who had stopped his morning commute to watch the parade. He gestured toward Hayes with obvious admiration. Standing there doing his duty even after being attacked by some spoiled rich woman, that's a real professional. The construction worker's words resonated throughout the crowd because they perfectly captured what everyone was thinking. Here was a young man who had dedicated his life to service, maintaining perfect discipline even while being physically assaulted, standing in stark contrast to a woman who couldn't handle the minor inconvenience of standing in a public viewing area like everyone else. Margaret's face was now completely drained of color, as she finally began to understand the full scope of her situation. The crowd's reaction was making it clear that this wasn't just a legal problem. It was a complete destruction of her public reputation. Every phone camera pointed in her direction was broadcasting her shame to the world, and there would be no way to control the narrative or spin the story in her favor. "I've never seen anything like this," whispered a street vendor to his colleague as they watched the scene unfold. "Rich people think they can do whatever they want, but she picked the wrong person to mess with. You don't touch the guards." Several veterans in the crowd began sharing their own stories about military service and the respect that should be shown to those in uniform. Their voices carried special authority as they spoke about the dedication and sacrifice required to serve in ceremonial roles. Each personal account only served to make Margaret's behavior seem more outrageous and inexcusable. "I served 20 years in the Army," said a woman wearing a veteran's pin on her jacket. "I know what it takes to stand at attention like that. What she did is not just assault. It's an insult to everyone who has ever worn a uniform." The crowd's anger was also fueled by the fact that Margaret's behavior seemed to represent everything people disliked about privilege and entitlement. Her assumption that her wealth made her better than everyone else, her complete lack of respect for rules that applied to ordinary people, and her willingness to resort to violence when she didn't get her way, struck many observers as symptoms of a larger social problem. "This is what's wrong with society," declared a university student who had been live-streaming the entire incident. "Rich people thinking they can buy their way out of anything and treat regular people like garbage. Well, guess what? Your money can't fix this." As police officers moved to arrest Margaret, the crowd began spontaneously organizing to ensure that justice would be served. People were sharing contact information to serve as witnesses, comparing their video footage to make sure the incident was thoroughly documented, and discussing how to make sure the story received the attention it deserved. "We all need to make sure this doesn't get buried," said a local business owner who had witnessed the entire confrontation. "People like her are used to making problems disappear with money and lawyers, but not this time. Too many people saw what happened." The collective response was remarkable in its unity. Despite coming from different backgrounds, ages, and walks of life, the crowd had found common ground in their shared outrage over Margaret's behavior. They had witnessed something that violated their basic sense of fairness and decency, and they were determined to ensure that there would be consequences for her actions. Within hours of Margaret Thornfield's assault on Sergeant William Hayes, videos of the incident had spread across every major social media platform on Earth. The hashtag Privileged Karen began trending worldwide as millions of people watched the shocking footage of a wealthy woman slapping a royal guard during an official ceremony. News outlets from London to Tokyo picked up the story, making Margaret one of the most infamous people on the planet overnight. The arrest itself became another spectacle, as Margaret continued to demand special treatment even while being handcuffed. "This is all a misunderstanding," she kept repeating as officers led her through the crowd toward a waiting police vehicle. "I'm sure once we sort this out, everyone will understand that I was just having a difficult morning." But the crowd had no interest in understanding or forgiveness. As Margaret was escorted away, people continued to document her every move, ensuring that her walk of shame would be preserved forever. Some spectators followed the police procession for several blocks, calling out their opinions about entitled rich people and the importance of respecting those who serve their country. The legal consequences began almost immediately. Margaret was charged with assault on a public official, disrupting a royal ceremony and creating a public disturbance. Because the incident involved a member of the Royal Guard during an official function, the charges carried enhanced penalties that could result in significant jail time. Her expensive lawyers would later argue that she had been under unusual stress, but no court would accept that as justification for physically attacking a ceremonial guard. The social consequences proved to be even more severe than the legal ones. Margaret's family textile business began receiving thousands of negative reviews and calls for boycotts within days of the incident. Major retailers canceled contracts rather than be associated with the company, and several royal charities returned donations that had been made in the Thornfield family name. The wealth and social connections that Margaret had always relied upon began evaporating as people distanced themselves from her toxic behavior. Sergeant William Hayes, meanwhile, became an international symbol of professionalism and dignity under pressure. The image of him standing at perfect attention with Margaret's handprint still visible on his cheek was shared millions of times as an example of true character and dedication to duty. He received letters of support from veterans organizations worldwide and was later commended by his commanding officers for maintaining his composure under extraordinary circumstances. The incident also sparked broader conversations about privilege, entitlement, and the treatment of public servants. Social commentators used Margaret's behavior as an example of how wealth and status could corrupt people's basic sense of humanity and respect for others. Her complete inability to accept that rules applied to her became a case study in the dangers of unchecked privilege. The young mother, who had originally been occupying the viewing spot that Margaret wanted, was interviewed by several news outlets. She handled the attention with grace and dignity, emphasizing that she felt sorry for Margaret's children and grandchildren who would have to live with the shame of her behavior. "I hope this serves as a lesson that money can't buy you respect," she said. "Respect has to be earned through how you treat other people." Margaret's attempts to rehabilitate her image through public relations campaigns and charitable donations failed spectacularly. Every effort to present herself as reformed was met with reminders of the video showing her assault on Sergeant Hayes. The incident had been so thoroughly documented and so widely shared that there was no way to escape its consequences or convince people that it didn't represent her true character. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, during which Margaret's behavior became even more erratic as she struggled to cope with her fall from social grace. Her marriage ended in divorce when her husband grew tired of being associated with her notoriety, and several of her longtime friends cut off contact to protect their own reputations. The privileged world that had always protected her from consequences had finally abandoned her completely. Sergeant Hayes was promoted and received several commendations for his service, while Margaret was sentenced to community service working with veterans organizations, a punishment that many observers felt was particularly appropriate given her disrespectful treatment of someone in military service. She was also required to make a public apology, though her insincere delivery only reinforced people's negative opinions of her character. The incident at the Royal Parade became a permanent part of internet culture, referenced whenever people discussed entitled behavior or the importance of treating others with respect regardless of their social status. Margaret Thornfield's name became synonymous with privilege gone wrong, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of believing that wealth and family connections place someone above basic human decency. Years later, people would still share the video as an example of instant karma and the power of social media to hold people accountable for their actions. The moment when Margaret raised her hand to slap Sergeant Hayes had lasted only seconds, but its consequences would follow her for the rest of her life. In trying to assert her superiority over others, she had instead revealed the emptiness of character that no amount of money could ever fix.